I'm Daniel Santos, the head of security research at Forescout, and we do have a group at Forescout called Vedere Labs, which does the threat intelligence and security research that powers a lot of the company's offerings, right? So I just wanted to start to talk by talking a little bit about the things that we do at Forescout and at Vedere Labs. You may have heard of Forescout as a company that is traditionally selling network access control solutions for close to 20 years now. We have expanded a lot in recent years. We also do security for IoT, OT. We are doing threat detection and response now, and we basically have a comprehensive, holistic platform for security, cybersecurity across, all of the assets at an organization, including IT, IoT, OT, and so on. But what does Vedere Labs do, right? So Vedere Labs is the Forescout threat intelligence arm, and what we do is we gather data from the networks that the Forescout is monitoring, but also from external third parties, from things that we observe at honeypots, things that we observe in terms of malware that we capture, and so on. We correlate all that information and transform that into threat intel that is shared with our customers, shared with the community, and that powers a lot of the mitigation and the response that the product has to offer. So I want to talk today about one specific piece of research that we did that will be released pretty soon, which is this 2022 threat roundup. So what we did there is we basically took a snapshot of that data related to last year, the second half of last year, and we wanted to understand what does it tell us about the threat landscape, right? About how companies should be observing this threat landscape and what they can do to protect themselves. So we collected all the information that we get from, from these honeypots on the second half of the year, which gave us more than 100 million attacks there, something close to 10 attacks per second. Thousands and thousands of different types of exploits, thousands of malware samples, and we distilled that into some interesting observations and statistics that I'm going to go over in the next couple of slides. So the first thing we observe is that nowadays attacks come from anywhere, right? You all hear about, as it was discussed before, the APTs from Russia and China and North Korea and so on. But really, if you forget about just the APTs, the attacks that we observe on the internet are coming from everywhere. We observed attacks coming from more than 190 countries and territories, hundreds of thousands of different IP addresses, and hundreds of different autonomous systems on the internet. And it's interesting that, yes, there is a prevalence on attackers coming from China or even the US because of legitimate hosting or bulletproof hosting in Russia and so on and so on. We do observe all these trends. But we see a lot of interesting things as well. We see a lot of companies and organizations that have been compromised and that are having their devices used to spread botnets, to spread malware on the internet, and then basically to further attack other companies. So, just blocking IPs based on their country of origin is really not an answer anymore, and you really need to drill down and understand what those attacks actually mean, where they're coming from, and not just judging a country of origin as something malicious. And what those IPs are actually doing, it connects back to the previous talk as well, is they're trying to get in via credentials, right? Whether those are stolen valid credentials or brute forcing or any or password spraying or any of those kinds of attacks, credentials are the way to get in. And mainly remote management software is typically the top target, and that includes remote desktop like RDP, VNC, and things like that, but also remote management like SSH, Telnet, and so on. So we see that the vast majority of the attacks are targeting remote management via the use of credentials. And after that, you have attacks that are exploiting web services and network infrastructure and things like that as well. But as discussed before, really the use of valid credentials is the top attack vector. But when we drill down to exploits, it's interesting to see that they're not just exploits for traditional applications anymore. You don't just see web applications being exploited or web servers or things like that. We actually see, and we started seeing that after specifically Log4j came about, that there are a lot of attacks now on software libraries, right? So vulnerabilities that are supply chain issues that spread across several types of applications, devices, and so on and so on. So we do observe Log4j was the most exploited vulnerability that we observed last year. But after that, we see issues in TCP/IP stacks, for instance, which is some research that we did at Forescout and other researchers did at other companies, showing how TCP/IP stacks are a component in IoT devices that are shared across many vendors, many devices, and they're currently being attacked by threat actors, and that allows them with a single exploit to look at a very enlarged attack surface. And if we drill down even more, we'll see the operational technology per se is a constant target, both of exploits and of scanning and probing on the internet and so on. So many people still think of operational technology as something that maybe doesn't affect them, or maybe it's only the realm of APT threats or nation states and so on. And it's not what we observe with hard data, right? We do see that there's a lot of probing of operational technology, and that includes both, what you would expect in terms of critical infrastructure with protocols used in water treatment and distribution, electricity, and so on, but also things that apply much more to typical organizations like building automation protocols and things that you would see in almost every organization nowadays. And as I said, most of what we observe there is probing and trying to recognize what devices are there, what protocols are being used, but also specific exploits. And I do put an example there of a serial to IP converter, which is a typical device that connects PLCs to the rest of the network, and basically how one threat actor was trying to exploit that on one of our honeypots, right? So paying attention to not just the traditional attack surface, but the enlarged attack surface with IoT devices and OT is really important these days. After initial access, what we typically observe is discovery techniques on the system, right? So there is a lot of understanding what is the operating system, what's the architecture, what's the file system capabilities, memory capabilities, and so on, to be able to deploy further malware. And this is interesting because it actually tells us that attacks are not 100% fully automated, right? They might take a couple of minutes, they might take months, but there is a limited, there is some time, there is a window where you can detect and you can react to an ongoing attack, right? So discovery is the majority of what we detect on our honeypots, but you will also see persistence, execution of malware, and other actions. But again, the key takeaway is that if discovery does take some time, you have some time to act. And then, as I said, there is dropping of malware, right? What we see mostly these days is ransomware and botnets or crypto miners that are specifically on those honeypots. That's the three largest categories. Everybody knows about ransomware. Everybody knows that it's a huge threat. There is ransomware that started for Windows platforms, started with data encryption. Everybody knows this, but they have recently moved to data extortion and basically exfiltration of data and extorting companies to pay so that data isn't published. They are targeting Linux, virtualization servers, and so on. So the attack surface for ransomware is increasing very, very rapidly. And after that, we see something that we actually wanted to discuss further in the report that is accompanying this presentation, which is emerging threats in the form of botnets, right? So typically, there are two types of botnets that people think about. There's the Windows botnets that often are used to drop ransomware and other types of malware. And there's the IoT botnets that target, IP cameras, Wi-Fi routers, and things like that with, again, valid credentials, brute forcing credentials, and so on. Well, what we see is what we call an emerging threat. There is some botnets that are starting to kind of blurry the lines between these two domains, right, and kind of crossing between IT and IoT. And one specific example we mentioned there is Chaos, the Chaos botnet, which is one of the many hundreds probably of variants that surfaced after Mirai in 2016. There is a long genealogy of malware families that came inspired by Mirai. Chaos is the latest example where they pack a lot of exploits for IoT devices, as I mentioned, Wi-Fi routers, IP cameras, and so on, but they also pack exploits for IT servers and the capability, a framework with the capability to download from the C2 new exploits and execute them on the network, which can be used for lateral movement, right? And what that tells us is that basically attackers are investigating and trying the possibility of enter organizations via IoT, exposed IoT devices, and move laterally to the rest of the IT organization. So looking ahead, right, as I mentioned, blurred lines between IT and IoT. So chaos is a very specific example of that, but we do expect that this is a trend that is starting and that will continue in the future to bear fruits for attackers, right? We looked into the possibility of malware crossing from IoT to OT to even operational technology a couple of years behind as a research proof of concept, as an idea. And what we see is that there has been a lot of chatter between attackers or among attackers with these kinds of ideas, and now they're actually implementing this. So in terms of takeaways, you know, we observed thousands or hundreds of thousands of attacks and attackers out there, probing systems, but they are just not doing the same kind of probing that you would expect for IT vulnerabilities, for the typical you know, credentials and so on, right? They are also targeting IoT and OT attacks and things like that. So the attack surface is definitely enlarging, and you see that reflected in the type of malware that is emerging these days, the type of IoT malware that is following a long line of evolution of botnets. And if we talk about risk mitigation, if we talk about not just what Forescout does, but what we believe is important for, is basic really for cybersecurity, we divide that into 3 key pillars, right? So risk and exposure management, understanding what assets are on your network and understanding really every asset on your network, not just IT, not just OT or IoT, what kind of risk they bring, how they're communicating to other assets, or do they have, you know, any possible malicious activity on them. Network security, what then you do with this risk and exposure, how can you control devices on the network, make sure that they're compliant, make sure that they adhere to company policies and so on. And again, extending that not just to the typical IT environment, not just to the typical endpoint, but also to all the assets on your network. And finally, threat detection and response, right? When the previous layers fail, as the previous speaker spoke about, you need threat detection, you need the possibility to respond automatically to threats that are occurring on the network, right? So you need the capability to quickly detect that something wrong is going on out of the hundreds or potentially thousands or millions of logs that you have on your SOC. What is the true threat that is happening at that moment, and how you can automatically respond to that, again, with all, you know, taking into account all the assets on the network, not just the IT side, not just the IT or the OT side. And I put the threat intelligence part as kind of the basis for those 3 pillars out there, because as I've been discussing throughout this presentation, right, the attack surface is moving from IoT to OT and enlarging what attackers can do. And you need to be up to date with threat intelligence to understand how these attacks are moving and how that can affect your cybersecurity strategy, your cybersecurity investments, but also in terms of tactical detection of threats and tactical response to threats. So that's what I had to say. Thank you very much. Feel free to come and visit us at our booth on the exhibition hall, and we'll be happy to talk more about what Forescout does.